Welcome to Testaments of Faith, Saul, the king who lost God's favor, Chapter 1. The coronation of the chosen one, the beginning of the age of kings. The sun shone over Israel, marking the beginning of a new era for God's chosen people. For centuries, God himself had ruled over Israel, raising judges and prophets to lead the nation. But now, the people demanded something different. They no longer wanted to rely solely on divine guidance. They wanted to be like the other nations, with a human king to command them. And God granted their request. Saul, the young man from Benjamin, was tall, strong, and striking in appearance. To human eyes, he was the perfect leader. Samuel, obeying God's command, poured oil over his head and declared, "The Lord has anointed you as king over his inheritance." But instead of rejoicing, Saul was overcome with fear. He saw himself as too small for such a great task. Still, on the day of his public coronation, Samuel gathered all the tribes and proclaimed, "Behold, the king you have asked for." But when they searched for Saul, he was found hiding among the baggage, trembling with fear. Though reluctant, Saul was brought before the people. When they saw him, Israel shouted in unison, "Long live the king!" The chosen young man was led to the throne, and Samuel, Israel's last judge, raised his voice and warned the people, "If you fear the Lord and serve him, both you and your king will prosper. But if you reject him, you will perish." In that moment, Israel cared little for the consequences. They were blinded by the excitement of finally having a king. Saul's destiny was set, but he did not yet realize that his greatest battle would not be against armies, but against his own heart. Chapter 2. The first victory. Saul's moment of glory. The throne was still new to Saul, but rest would not last long. A king's destiny is forged in battle, and his first trial was approaching. Across the Jordan, Nahash, king of the Ammonites, marched against Jabesh-Gilead, an Israelite city. Surrounded and hopeless, the elders of the city sought a treaty, but Nahash laughed and set forth a humiliating condition. He would gouge out the right eye of every man in the city as a mark of submission. Terrified, the leaders of Jabesh-Gilead asked for 7 days to seek help. Messengers rode swiftly to Gibeah, where Saul resided. When the news spread, the people wept, feeling powerless. But when Saul heard their cries, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and his expression changed. Fury and courage filled his heart. Without hesitation, he took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent them throughout Israel with a message, "Whoever does not follow Saul and Samuel into battle, so shall his oxen be done." The response was immediate. 300,000 Israelites gathered under his command. At dawn, Saul divided his army into 3 companies and launched a surprise attack on the Ammonite camp. The slaughter was overwhelming. The Ammonites fled in panic, and Jabesh-Gilead was saved. The people, who once doubted Saul, now praised him. Samuel then gathered the nation at Gilgal and proclaimed, "Today, you have seen that the Lord has given you a king. Now, remain faithful to him." On that day, Saul stood at the peak of his glory. He had the favor of the people and, above all, the favor of God. But the true test of his kingship was yet to come. Chapter 3. The War Against the Philistines. The first step toward the fall. The glory of victory over the Ammonites had strengthened Saul's throne, but a far greater enemy was rising against Israel, the Philistines. Feared warriors, well-equipped with chariots and elite forces, they had kept the Hebrews under oppression for years, limiting their weapons and ensuring their dominance. Now, they were ready to crush Israel once and for all. The Philistine army assembled at Michmash, with 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the shore. Meanwhile, Saul gathered his own army, but the difference was humiliating. The Israelites were terrified. When they saw the strength of the Philistines, many fled, hiding in caves and tombs. The few who remained trembled, hoping for a miracle. Samuel had promised to meet Saul to offer sacrifices to the Lord before battle. But days passed, and Samuel did not arrive. Saul's heart burned with anxiety. With each passing hour, more soldiers deserted. Overcome by the fear of losing his army before the battle even began, he made a desperate decision. Though he knew only the prophet Samuel could offer sacrifices to the Lord, he took the sacred instruments and performed the ritual himself. As soon as he finished the sacrifice, Samuel arrived. The prophet looked at Saul with a solemn expression and asked, "What have you done?" Saul tried to justify his impatience. "The people were scattering, you did not come, and the Philistines were ready to attack. So I offered the sacrifice." Samuel's response was devastating. "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord, and now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has already chosen another, a man after his own heart." Saul stood in shock. In a single moment, his fate had changed. He would continue to wear the crown for years, but from that day forward, he would rule without God's favor. Chapter 4. The Foolish Oath, the rash decision that nearly cost Jonathan's life. The war against the Philistines raged on, and Saul desperately sought ways to strengthen his army, now weakened by the loss of God's favor. But while Saul relied on his own strength, his son Jonathan displayed something far greater: faith. Fearlessly, Jonathan and his armor-bearer ventured alone toward a Philistine outpost. Before attacking, Jonathan declared, "The Lord can give us victory, whether by many or by few." When the Philistines mocked them, he knew God was with him. He and his armor-bearer struck, swiftly killing 20 men, and a supernatural panic fell upon the Philistine army. Back at the Israelite camp, Saul noticed the chaos in the Philistine forces and ordered an immediate attack. The Philistines, gripped by fear and confusion, turned against each other, and Israel pressed forward. But at that moment, Saul made another fatal mistake. Before the battle was over, he made a rash vow: "Cursed be any man who eats before evening, until I have avenged myself on my enemies." The weary soldiers were now forced to fight on empty stomachs, and their strength began to wane. Jonathan, unaware of the oath, tasted some wild honey, instantly regaining his energy. But when Saul found out, he declared that Jonathan must die for breaking his command. The people, outraged, rose against the king. "Jonathan has brought us victory today. He shall not die." For the first time, the army defied Saul's authority, forcing him to back down. His own recklessness had nearly cost his son's life and revealed that his obsession with power was driving him further from God's will. Chapter 5. The Fatal Disobedience. When Saul rejected God's command. The war against the Philistines had been won, but God's trust in Saul was rapidly fading. The king had proven himself impulsive and prideful, placing his own judgment above the will of the Lord. Now, God would give him one final test, a mission that would determine once and for all if he was worthy of the crown. Samuel stood before Saul with a clear word from the Lord: "Go and attack the Amalekites and destroy them completely. Do not spare anything, neither people nor livestock. Everything must be devoted to God's judgment." This was an ancient command, for the Amalekites had cowardly attacked Israel in the past, and now their judgment had come. Saul set out for battle and defeated King Agag and his army. But instead of fully obeying God's command, Saul decided to spare the king and keep the best livestock. Looking at the riches, he and his men thought, "Why waste so much wealth?" The next day, Samuel went to meet Saul and found him erecting a monument to himself. The prophet took a deep breath and asked, "Why did you not obey the voice of the Lord?" With a smug smile, Saul replied, "But I did obey. I destroyed the Amalekites and only spared the best animals to offer as sacrifices to the Lord." Then Samuel uttered the words that would seal Saul's fate. "Does the Lord take more pleasure in sacrifices than in obedience? You have rejected the word of the Lord, and now he has rejected you as king." The word struck Saul like a thunderbolt. In panic, he grabbed Samuel's robe, tearing a piece of the prophet's garment. Samuel looked at him and said, "So the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and given it to another, better than you." The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and from that day forward, he would rule as a king without the presence of God. Chapter 6. The Spirit of the Lord departs when a king becomes a lost man. God's rejection of Saul was not just symbolic, it was real and devastating. The Spirit of the Lord, which once strengthened him, departed from him. In place of divine peace came torment. An evil spirit began to trouble him, filling his mind with restlessness, rage, and fear. The king of Israel was no longer the same. Saul wandered through his palace with hollow eyes and a dark expression. His heart was tormented, yet he refused to admit his guilt. His pride kept him from true repentance. His servants began to notice his suffering and suggested an idea. "My lord, let us find someone skilled in playing the harp, so that your soul may find relief." The king nodded in agreement. He did not seek God, but he sought temporary relief from his pain. And so, the name of a young shepherd was brought before the king, David, the son of Jesse. David was just a simple young man from Bethlehem, but God had already chosen him as the next king. When he entered the palace, Saul had no idea that this humble boy would one day take his throne. As David played, something incredible happened. The music filled the great hall, and the torment that haunted Saul disappeared. For the first time in a long while, the king found peace. But he did not know that this peace would be short-lived and that David, the one who soothed his soul, would one day become his greatest enemy. Chapter 7. Saul's jealousy. When envy becomes a curse. David's presence in Saul's palace became more frequent. Whenever the evil spirit tormented him, the young man played his harp, bringing relief to the troubled king. But something began to shift inside Saul. He saw in David a light that he himself had lost. The favor of the Lord, once upon him, was now upon the young shepherd. And a dangerous feeling took root in the king's heart: jealousy. What ignited this jealousy was a moment of triumph. Israel once again faced the Philistines, and David, armed with only a sling and 5 stones, struck down the giant Goliath, delivering the greatest victory the nation had seen in years. David's name spread like wildfire across the land. The people celebrated the young warrior, and women sang in the streets, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." When Saul heard this, his fists clenched, and his face twisted in anger. "They credit him with greater honor than me. What more does he need but the kingdom itself?" That night, as David played his harp as usual, Saul's eyes burned with hatred. Without warning, he grabbed his spear and hurled it at the young man, who dodged it just in time. David looked at the king and saw something he had never seen before: a man consumed by darkness. Saul tried again, but David escaped. From that day on, Saul feared David, knowing that the Lord was with him. What had started as mere jealousy was now becoming a deadly obsession. Chapter 8. The Hunt for David. When hatred blinds a king. Saul's jealousy turned into full-blown paranoia. Every time he saw David, he felt his throne slipping away. The young warrior did not seek power, but God's favor followed him wherever he went. And that drove the king mad. His secret attempts to kill David had failed, so he decided on something even more terrible: hunting him openly. David realized the palace was no longer safe. Even as the commander of the armies, he had no defense against the king's fury. So he fled. But Saul would not rest until David was dead. He gathered his men and pursued him. The wilderness, the caves, and the mountains of Israel became the setting for a deadly hunt. David became a fugitive, hiding in caves, relying only on God and a handful of loyal warriors. One night, as Saul and his soldiers rested in a cave, David and his men crept in silently. The perfect opportunity lay before him. Saul slept defenseless, his spear stuck in the ground beside him. His warriors whispered, "This is your chance. God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Kill him." But David moved closer and, instead of killing Saul, cut a piece of his robe. When Saul awoke and left the cave, David appeared atop the hill and shouted, "My lord, why do you pursue me? If I wished, I could have taken your life. But I will not lift my hand against the Lord's anointed." Saul stood frozen, his spear trembling in his grip. The truth was before him. David was righteous, and he, a king consumed by madness. With tears in his eyes, he murmured, "You are more righteous than I. Now I know you will be king, and the Lord will establish you over Israel." But even as he acknowledged this, the darkness within Saul would not let him surrender so easily. Chapter 9. The End of a King. The Tragedy of Saul and the Rise of David. Saul's days were numbered. His obsession with destroying David had driven him further from God. His heart was hardened, his mind consumed by fear. He no longer ruled, he merely survived, clinging to a throne that was no longer his. Then came the final war. The Philistines attacked Israel once more. But this time, the Lord was no longer with Saul. Desperate, the king sought divine guidance, but God remained silent. No prophet, no dream, no priest gave him direction. The glory had departed from him. In sheer despair, he did the unthinkable. He sought out a witch in Endor, violating the very law he had enforced against sorcery. There, the spirit of Samuel appeared and pronounced his sentence. "The Lord has torn the kingdom from you and given it to another. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me." Saul's blood ran cold. The king who was once chosen was now condemned. The next day, Israel's armies were slaughtered by the Philistines. On the heights of Mount Gilboa, Saul's sons fell one by one, including his faithful son Jonathan. The wounded and humiliated king saw that all was lost. To avoid capture and disgrace, Saul fell upon his own sword. There, atop the mountain, Israel's first king met his tragic end. The throne was empty, and now, God's chosen one would take his rightful place. Far away, David received the news. He wept for Saul and for Jonathan, mourning the tragedy of a man who had everything but lost the most important thing, the presence of God. Saul's era had ended, and David's reign was only beginning. The story of Saul teaches us that a man's greatest tragedy is not losing his kingdom, but losing the presence of God. Saul began his journey with promise and greatness, but his arrogance and disobedience led him away from the Lord. God does not delight in empty sacrifices, but in a sincere heart. May we never seek power above God's will, for the glory of this world is fleeting, but faithfulness to the Lord endures forever. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content. Stay with God, and see you next time on Testaments of Faith. Thank you.